Maria Lopez had always been a woman of simple means, content with the quiet rhythm of her days. For as long as she could remember, her life had revolved around cleaning, tidying, and ensuring the sprawling mansion of Arthur Blackwood remained pristine. The work was steady, and she enjoyed it in her own way. It offered her solitude, a sense of purpose, and oddly, a place of refuge. Every morning she would rise before the sun, lace up her well-worn shoes, tie her apron, and set out for the estate, her life of service defined by the creaking walls and endless corridors of Blackwood Manor. The mansion itself was an enigma, an ancient structure with high stone walls that looked down over a mist-shrouded valley. It had been built by Arthur's great-grandfather, a shipping magnate from an era long past. The estate was perched on a hill, surrounded by dense woods and a sprawling garden that Maria often felt resembled more of a labyrinth than a place of beauty. Wild and untamed, the garden had a life of its own, and she rarely ventured there unless absolutely necessary. Most of the rooms in the mansion were seldom used, their thick velvet curtains drawn, furniture draped in dust sheets that had been there for as long as Maria could remember. Only a few select spaces, the library, the dining room, and Mr. Blackwood's private study, were regularly maintained. Mr. Blackwood himself preferred these rooms, living a life confined to shadows and old books, it seemed. He rarely ventured out, and even more rarely spoke. For years, Maria had tried to understand him, but Arthur Blackwood was not a man one could easily comprehend. His wealth was vast, inherited from his family's long history of business and trading across continents, but he never spoke of it. In fact, it seemed that the very mention of money or possessions caused a flicker of discomfort in his eyes, as though such things were a burden rather than a blessing. The townsfolk often speculated about him, calling him a recluse or mad genius, but Maria saw something else, a deep loneliness that hung around him like a fog. He wasn't unkind, though. He was polite in his own way, always acknowledging Maria's work with a nod, though their exchanges were brief. Some mornings, she would find him sitting in his usual chair in the library, lost in thought as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the heavy drapes, casting long shadows on the bookshelves. His face, gaunt and pale, would be illuminated in patches, making him look older than his 50-odd years. He often sat there, staring into the fire or the window, as if waiting for something or someone who would never arrive. Yet for all his strangeness, Maria had grown fond of Mr. Blackwood. Over the years, they had developed an unspoken routine. She would arrive in the early hours of the morning, let herself into the house, and begin her work. By the time Mr. Blackwood rose for breakfast, the downstairs would already be immaculate, the fire in the hearth crackling warmly, the air rich with the smell of fresh coffee and polished wood. He would silently acknowledge her presence, sometimes offering a brief smile, other times simply watching her for a moment before retreating into his solitude. There were moments, however, when Maria sensed something deeper lurking beneath the surface of his silence. Occasionally, she would catch him staring at her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable, as though he wanted to say something, but was unable to find the words. At other times, he would disappear into his study for days on end, leaving her to wonder what kept him locked away in that room, the heavy oak door always closed, his presence hidden behind it. It was during these absences that the house itself began to feel different, almost alive. The creaking floorboards, the rattling of windows during storms, the distant hum of the wind through the empty halls, Blackwood Manor seemed to echo with secrets. It wasn't just the isolation that unnerved Maria, but the feeling that the mansion was watching her. On more than one occasion, she felt the hair on the back of her neck stand on end as she worked, as though someone or something was observing her from the shadows. Of course, she would turn and find nothing. It was, after all, just a house, and she had spent so many years in its company that her nerves must have been playing tricks on her. But still, that feeling lingered, especially when she ventured into the lesser-used parts of the mansion. those forgotten rooms where time seemed to have stopped altogether. Among all the peculiarities of the house, there was one room that fascinated her most of all: the attic. She had never been allowed inside. The narrow staircase that led to it was tucked away behind a small door near the back of the mansion, and Mr. Blackwood had made it clear that it was off-limits. "There's nothing of interest there," he had said once in his typically brusque manner. But Maria couldn't help but wonder what lay beyond that door. It was the one place she had never cleaned, never touched, and it felt as though it held some part of Mr. Blackwood's life that he had hidden away even from himself. Despite her curiosity, Maria respected his wishes. Over the years, she had come to appreciate the delicate balance of her position. She was the caretaker, not just of the physical space, but of Mr. Blackwood's peace of mind. To cross any boundaries, even out of curiosity, might upset the fragile understanding they had built. So, she continued her work, quietly, diligently, and without question. Then came that fateful morning, a morning that would unravel everything she thought she knew about Arthur Blackwood and the life she had built in his shadow. It had been an unusually cold autumn night. The fog was thick outside, and Maria had arrived at the mansion in the early hours, as always. She let herself in and began her routine, but something was different. The house felt colder, more still than usual. As she made her way toward the kitchen to start the fire in the hearth, she realized that the usual faint sounds of Mr. Blackwood moving about upstairs were absent. At first, she thought nothing of it. He had often stayed in bed longer during the colder months. But as the hours passed, and there was still no sign of him, a knot of unease formed in her chest. She made her way to the study, where he often spent his mornings. The door was slightly ajar, which was unusual. Mr. Blackwood always kept it closed. Tentatively, she knocked. No answer. She knocked again, louder this time, but still nothing. Her pulse quickened. Something wasn't right. Pushing the door open, Maria stepped inside. The room was dim, the curtains drawn, casting long shadows over the desk and shelves. And there, in his chair by the window, sat Mr. Blackwood. His eyes were closed, his hands resting in his lap. For a moment, Maria thought he had simply fallen asleep while reading one of his many books. "Mr. Blackwood?" she called softly, taking a few steps closer. No response. She reached out to gently touch his arm, and as her fingers made contact with his cold skin, a gasp escaped her lips. His body was rigid, unmoving. She knew in that instant that he was gone. The realization hit her like a wave. The man who had been such a constant, silent presence in her life was now just a lifeless form in the chair. A part of her wanted to collapse, to let the weight of the moment wash over her, but her instincts took over. She had to call someone, inform the authorities. Her mind raced as she backed out of the room, leaving the door open behind her. But as she left the study, one thought lingered at the edge of her consciousness, a nagging question that she couldn't shake. Why had Mr. Blackwood, a man who had always seemed so distant and untouchable, been found in such a peaceful, almost deliberate position? And why, in that moment, did it feel as though his death was not the end of something, but the beginning? Maria could not have known then how drastically her life was about to change, or how the quiet mysteries of Blackwood Manor were only just beginning to reveal themselves. The days following Arthur Blackwood's sudden death passed in a blur for Maria. The house that had once been a backdrop to her routine now felt hollow and haunted by the absence of its master. The first night after the discovery, Maria found herself lying awake in her small room at the back of the mansion, staring at the ceiling as the reality of what had happened settled deep in her bones. Arthur was gone, just like that. No goodbyes, no explanation, just the cold, silent void left in his wake. She kept replaying the moment she found him sitting there as if he'd simply drifted off, and yet knowing deep down that he had left forever. The house, in its quiet way, seemed to mourn as well. Every corner, every shadow felt more profound, the stillness more suffocating. The mansion, already large and somewhat eerie in its old age, now felt like an enormous tomb. Maria had always found comfort in her work, but after Arthur's death, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even during the day, when sunlight streamed through the windows, there was an oppressive weight in the air. The echo of her footsteps through the hallways felt louder, the sound bouncing back from the high ceilings like a reminder that she was truly alone now. She hadn't known what to expect following his passing. Arthur had no close family, at least none that she knew of, and there had been no funeral service beyond the simple, unceremonious burial that the solicitor had arranged. She was the only one present, as Arthur was lowered into the ground in the overgrown cemetery behind the mansion, under the shadow of a massive oak tree that had been there for centuries. The entire event took less than an hour, and when it was over, Maria was left with nothing but a lingering sense of finality, though she couldn't quite place why it felt so incomplete. A week later, the knock at the door finally came. Gregory Hale, Mr. Blackwood's solicitor, arrived at the mansion just as the evening light was fading, his expression grave and formal as always. Maria had seen him once or twice before. He was a serious man with slicked-back silver hair, a sharply cut suit, and the demeanor of someone who had spent years dealing with the affairs of the rich and powerful. He spoke in clipped, measured tones, always calm and never revealing much emotion. He was exactly the kind of man Arthur would have trusted to handle his estate, a man of precision and cold efficiency. Maria led him into the study, the same room where she had found Arthur just days before. She tried not to linger on the memory, but it clung to her like an unwelcome shadow. She had no idea why Hale had requested to meet her, but something told her it wasn't just to discuss the details of the funeral. Once they were seated, Hale opened his briefcase with methodical care, extracting a thick folder of documents and placing it on the desk between them. He glanced at her over the rim of his glasses, his sharp eyes assessing her before he finally spoke. "Miss Lopez, as you are aware, I have been Mr. Blackwood's solicitor for many years, managing both his personal and financial affairs. His will, which was updated roughly 6 months ago, includes some unexpected instructions." Maria shifted uneasily in her chair. "Unexpected?" Hale gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Indeed, Mr. Blackwood had no direct heirs, no immediate family to speak of, as I'm sure you are aware. However, what I'm about to reveal may come as quite a shock to you." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the air. Maria sat perfectly still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she waited for him to continue. "Arthur Blackwood has left his entire estate to you," Hale said finally, his voice as measured as ever. "Everything, his properties, his assets, and all of his financial holdings. The entire Blackwood fortune is now yours." The words hung in the air, and for a moment Maria thought she hadn't heard him correctly. She blinked, certain that her mind had misinterpreted his meaning. I don't understand," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Hale's expression softened slightly, as though he had anticipated her shock. "I realize this is unexpected. To my knowledge, Mr. Blackwood never discussed his intentions with anyone. But it is all here, in his will. You are the sole beneficiary." Maria shook her head, her mind racing to make sense of what she was hearing. The sole beneficiary? Her? A maid? It seemed impossible, absurd even. She had been in Mr. Blackwood's employment for over 2 decades, yes, but they had never shared more than a professional relationship. Why would he leave her everything? It was unthinkable. "I don't understand," Maria repeated, her voice trembling slightly. "Why me? Why would he do this?" Hale cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. "I cannot say for certain. Arthur Blackwood was a private man, as you well know. He kept his reasons to himself. However, he was also meticulous. If he chose you, it was not done lightly." Everything is in order, legally speaking. The estate is now yours, including all of Mr. Blackwood's accounts, investments, and properties. Maria felt lightheaded, her thoughts spinning in every direction. She had always lived a life of simplicity. Her small, modest room at the back of the mansion was a reflection of that. The idea of inheriting a vast fortune, of suddenly becoming one of the wealthiest people she knew, was completely foreign to her. It didn't make sense. How could she, a woman who had scrubbed floors and polished silver for a living, suddenly be thrust into such a position? "I don't know anything about running an estate," she said, her voice barely audible. Hale leaned forward, his tone softening. "There will be people to help you. Financial advisors, estate managers. You won't have to navigate this alone. But the decision was made. Mr. Blackwood trusted you with everything, and it is now your responsibility." Maria sat there, her heart pounding in her chest, feeling as though the ground had just shifted beneath her feet. The life she had known, the simple, predictable existence of a housemaid, was gone in an instant. And in its place was something she had never imagined for herself. She felt like a trespasser, as though this fortune, this life of wealth, didn't truly belong to her. But according to the papers in front of her, it did. Hale cleared his throat again, sensing the magnitude of what he had just revealed. "There are some additional matters to attend to, but nothing urgent. The house, of course, is already in your possession, and the financial accounts will be transferred in due course. You'll need to meet with the estate's financial advisors, but that can be arranged at your convenience. For now, I would suggest taking some time to process everything." Maria nodded numbly, her mind still reeling. She wasn't sure what to say or even how to feel. Gratitude? Confusion? Fear? All of those emotions swirled within her, but none seemed to take precedence. She felt completely overwhelmed. As Hale gathered his papers and prepared to leave, he paused at the door, turning back to look at her. "One more thing, Miss Lopez," he said, his voice unusually hesitant. "In Mr. Blackwood's final weeks, he became preoccupied. He left instructions for you to be cautious. He said nothing specific, but it seemed important to him." Maria frowned, the knot in her stomach tightening. "Cautious? About what?" Hale shrugged slightly, his face unreadable. "He didn't elaborate, just said that you should be careful, especially in the coming months. Whatever that means, I felt it was my duty to pass it along." With that, he gave her a curt nod and stepped out of the study, leaving Maria alone with her thoughts. She sat there for what felt like hours, staring blankly at the papers Hale had left on the desk. The house was hers. The money was hers. The fortune was hers. But all of it felt wrong somehow, as though this wealth came with strings attached, with responsibilities she couldn't yet comprehend. She rose from the chair slowly, her legs shaky beneath her, and made her way back through the mansion. The once familiar halls now seemed foreign to her, as if they belonged to a different world, one that she hadn't asked to be part of. When she reached the grand staircase, she paused, looking up at the towering portrait of Arthur Blackwood that hung above it. His cold, piercing eyes stared back at her from the painting, as though he were still watching her, still guarding his secrets even from the grave. Why had he chosen her? What did he expect from her? And perhaps most importantly, what dangers had he hinted at with his cryptic warning? Maria didn't have any answers, but one thing was certain. Her life had just taken a turn she could never have anticipated. And deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that Arthur's death had set something in motion, something that went far beyond an inheritance. Something that, whether she liked it or not, would soon come knocking at her door. The days that followed were a whirlwind of disbelief and uncertainty for Maria. She found herself caught between the life she had always known, one of quiet, routine, and servitude, and the incomprehensible new reality of being a wealthy woman, the sole heir to a fortune she neither sought nor understood. Each morning, She awoke with the sense that it had all been a dream, half expecting to return to her duties as a maid. But as soon as she opened her eyes, the weight of Arthur Blackwood's will came crashing back, and the cold truth settled in. It was real. Everything had changed. Her first instinct was to continue working as she always had. The house, though eerily silent without Arthur's presence, still needed tending to. Dust gathered in the corners, the floors creaked beneath her feet, and the garden outside had grown even more wild and untamed since Arthur's passing. But as Maria moved through the rooms of the mansion, she began to feel a growing sense of detachment. This was no longer just the house she cleaned, the house where she had lived her modest life. It was her house now. Every object, every piece of furniture, every inch of the sprawling estate was hers. But with that ownership came a creeping unease. The mansion, which had always been a place of solitude and quiet, now seemed to whisper with secrets. Shadows stretched longer in the late afternoon light, and the creaks and groans of the old house felt more deliberate, as if the very walls were aware of her newfound role as its mistress. Maria couldn't shake the feeling that Arthur's presence still lingered, watching her from the dark corners of the house. She found herself glancing over her shoulder more often than usual, half expecting to see him standing there, his gaunt figure framed by the doorway, watching her with those cold, inscrutable eyes. The nights were worse. Maria had always been comfortable with the darkness, accustomed to the stillness of the manor after the sun set. But now, as she lay in her small room at the back of the house, the quiet felt oppressive. The house creaked and groaned more than ever, and the wind that swept through the valley seemed to wail like a distant, sorrowful cry. There were nights when she could swear she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her room, soft, deliberate steps that stopped just outside her door. Each time she would lie frozen in her bed, her heart pounding in her chest, waiting for the door to creak open. But it never did. The footsteps would stop, and the house would fall silent again, leaving her wide awake and trembling. Maria tried to push the feelings aside, to convince herself that it was nothing more than her imagination playing tricks on her. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread. Arthur's warning, the cryptic message relayed by Gregory Hale, echoed in her mind constantly. Be careful. But careful of what? The solicitor had offered no further explanation, and Maria had no idea what Arthur had been trying to protect her from. One afternoon, as she sat in the library, staring blankly at the ledger of accounts that had been passed down to her, she heard a knock at the door. It startled her, pulling her out of her thoughts. Visitors were a rare occurrence at Blackwood Manor. Aside from the occasional delivery or Hale's businesslike visits, few people ever ventured to the estate. When she opened the front door, she was greeted by the sight of a man in his late 30s, dressed in a tailored suit and holding a leather briefcase. His dark hair was neatly combed, and his smile was polite but cautious. Behind him stood a young woman in her early 20s, with soft brown curls and a nervous expression. She clutched a folder in her hands, as if holding on to it for dear life. "Miss Lopez?" the man asked, his voice smooth and practiced. He extended a hand. "My name is Edward Sinclair. I'm a financial advisor with Sinclair & Reed. This is my assistant, Emily." The young woman gave a quick nod but said nothing, her eyes darting around as though taking in every detail of the house. Maria hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to make of the visitors. After a beat, she extended her hand to shake his, feeling the firmness of his grip. "Yes, I'm Maria. How can I help you?" Sinclair smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "We've been assigned to assist you with the management of your new assets and estate. Arthur Blackwood was a client of ours for many years, and we've been entrusted to continue overseeing the financial side of things. I understand this is all quite new for you, and we're here to help ease the transition." Maria wasn't sure how to respond. The idea of having a financial advisor felt as foreign to her as inheriting the fortune itself. She had never dealt with anything beyond her modest wages, and the prospect of managing a vast estate was overwhelming. Still, she knew she needed help. There were too many things she didn't understand, too many decisions that had to be made. "Thank you," Maria said, stepping aside to let them in. "Please, come in." Sinclair and Emily entered the grand foyer, their eyes quickly scanning the interior of the mansion. Maria led them into the study, the same room where Hale had delivered the news of her inheritance. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the walls. As they sat down, Sinclair opened his briefcase and pulled out several neatly organized folders. "I've gone over the details of the estate," he began, his tone professional and efficient. "It's quite substantial. In addition to the house and grounds, Mr. Blackwood's financial portfolio includes investments in various industries, stocks, bonds, properties, and even a few international holdings. It's all very well managed, and with the right guidance it will continue to grow." Maria nodded, trying to take it all in. "I've never dealt with anything like this before," she admitted, her voice hesitant. "I don't even know where to start." Sinclair gave her a reassuring smile. "That's why we're here. We'll walk you through everything step by step. You won't have to make any decisions on your own. Our firm has years of experience managing high-value estates like this, and will ensure that everything is handled properly." As Sinclair went over the details, explaining the various accounts and investments, Maria listened in a daze. It was all so far beyond anything she had ever imagined. Words like dividends, capital gains, and real estate holdings swirled around her, foreign concepts that made her feel even more out of place in this new life. Emily, the assistant, sat quietly beside Sinclair, occasionally flipping through documents or making notes, but she never spoke. Maria noticed the way the young woman's eyes darted around the room, as if she were cataloging every detail of the study. There was something about Emily's demeanor that unsettled Maria, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Perhaps it was just nerves. After all, they were handling the estate of one of the wealthiest men in the region. Or perhaps it was something more. As the meeting drew to a close, Sinclair handed Maria a folder with several key documents she would need to review. "Take your time with these," he said. "I know this is overwhelming, but we're just a phone call away. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. And of course, we'll be checking in regularly to ensure everything is running smoothly." Maria thanked them, her mind already swimming with the sheer volume of information she had been given. After seeing them out, she stood in the grand foyer for a long moment, staring at the closed door and feeling a sense of isolation that she couldn't shake. The mansion, once so familiar to her, now felt like a stranger's home. And the life she had lived before, all of it, seemed like a distant memory, as though it belonged to someone else. That night, Maria sat at the small table in the kitchen, sipping a cup of tea as she tried to process everything. She had never asked for this. She had never imagined a life beyond the quiet service she had known. And yet, here she was, the owner of an enormous estate, with wealth beyond her comprehension and responsibilities she could barely fathom. But as she stared into the flickering candlelight, one thought kept returning to her. Why had Arthur chosen her? What had prompted him, in those final months of his life, to leave everything to a woman who had been little more than a shadow in his home? She had never pried into his affairs, never questioned his life. Yet in his death, he had thrust her into a world she knew nothing about. And then, there was the warning. "Be careful," Gregory Hale had said. But of what? Arthur had been vague, cryptic. Was there something about the estate or about his fortune that Maria didn't yet know? Was there something dangerous lurking beneath the surface of all this wealth and privilege? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise. It was faint but distinct, a soft thud from somewhere upstairs. Maria's heart skipped a beat. She set down her teacup, listening intently. The house was old, prone to creaks and groans, but this sound was different. It was deliberate. Slowly, she rose from her chair, her feet moving almost against her will as she made her way to the grand staircase. The house was dark, the only light coming from the flickering candles she had lit in the hallway. She paused at the foot of the stairs, peering up into the shadowy expanse of the upper floor. Her pulse quickened. Had someone broken in? Or was it something else? Something that had been waiting for her to inherit this house, this life, this fortune? She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and began to climb the stairs. As Maria ascended the grand staircase, her heart thudded in her chest. Every step seemed to amplify the silence around her, the creaking of the wood beneath her feet echoing through the empty halls. The mansion was dark, lit only by the soft glow of the candle she had carried from the kitchen. Its flickering light cast eerie shadows on the walls, elongating shapes and making the familiar space feel foreign and threatening. She paused at the top of the stairs, her breath shallow as she strained to listen. The sound she had heard moments ago, the distinct thud, still echoed in her mind. It had come from somewhere on the second floor, though exactly where she couldn't be sure. The mansion was vast, with countless rooms and hallways, each one more imposing than the next. But she knew these halls, had walked them for years in service to Arthur Blackwood, and yet now every shadow, every closed door seemed to hold a secret. Maria stood frozen at the landing, her eyes darting from one darkened hallway to the next. Was someone in the house? The thought sent a chill down her spine. She was no stranger to the unsettling noises that old houses made, but this had been different, more purposeful. And it was not the first time she had heard strange things in the house since Arthur's passing. The creaks in the floor, the soft sound of footsteps outside her room at night, the sensation of being watched. All of it had been growing worse in the days since she had inherited the estate. But tonight, it felt more tangible. There was something in the air, a weight pressing down on her, making it harder to breathe. She clutched the candle tighter, the flame dancing nervously as she tried to gather her courage. Swallowing hard, Maria took a tentative step forward, her eyes scanning the hallway ahead. Arthur's private wing loomed at the far end of the corridor, its doors always locked and off-limits to everyone but him. Even in his death, Maria had never ventured inside. It had always felt wrong, like trespassing into a space that still belonged to him. But now, with the eerie silence of the house pressing in on her, the locked doors seemed to beckon. She turned toward the wing, her pulse quickening. What if Arthur had left something behind? Something that explained his strange behavior in his final weeks, the warning he had given through his solicitor. Be careful, he had said. But careful of what? The house itself? The fortune? Or something more sinister? As Maria approached Arthur's private rooms, the air seemed to grow colder. The hallway, usually just another part of the house, felt different tonight, as though the mansion itself was holding its breath. When she reached the heavy oak door to Arthur's study, she paused. The door was still locked, just as it had been since his death. She had the key, of course, left to her, along with everything else. But the idea of using it now filled her with dread. For a long moment, she hesitated, staring at the door with its intricate brass handle. Her hand shook as she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the small, ornate key. It felt heavy in her palm, as though the weight of the secrets it held was pressing down on her. Slowly, she inserted it into the lock, her hand trembling slightly. With a soft click, the lock disengaged. Maria held her breath as she turned the handle and pushed the door open. The air inside the room was musty, the scent of old books and leather filling her nostrils. The room was just as Arthur had left it, immaculate, with every piece of furniture perfectly arranged. A massive oak desk dominated the space, its surface covered in neatly stacked papers and ledgers. The tall windows, draped in heavy velvet curtains, allowed only a sliver of moonlight to filter into the room, casting long shadows across the floor. Maria stepped inside cautiously, her candle illuminating only a small part of the room. She had never spent much time in Arthur's study. It had always been a place of business, a room where he retreated to work late into the night. But now, standing there in the dim light, she felt an almost oppressive sense of unease. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for anything out of the ordinary. There were bookshelves lining the walls, filled with volumes on subjects Maria had no knowledge of: economics, philosophy, ancient history. The fireplace at the far end of the room was cold, the ashes from its last fire long since settled, and yet despite its pristine appearance, there was something unsettling about the space. She couldn't put her finger on it, but the room felt wrong, as though it were hiding something. She approached the desk slowly, her candle casting flickering shadows on the papers strewn across its surface. Most of them appeared to be financial documents, records of Arthur's investments, property deeds, and account statements. But as Maria's eyes skimmed over the papers, something caught her attention. One document, tucked partially beneath a ledger, bore Arthur's signature at the bottom. It was a letter, dated only days before his death. Maria's heart skipped a beat as she pulled the letter free, her hands shaking as she unfolded it. The handwriting was Arthur's, unmistakable in its neat, precise strokes. But the contents of the letter were what truly stunned her. "Maria," it began, "if you are reading this, then it means I am gone, and the secrets I have guarded for so long are now in your hands. I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner, but I feared what it might mean. For you, for me, for everything. There is more to my fortune than meets the eye, more to this house than you know. Be careful. There are those who will come for what I have left you, and they will not stop until they get it." Maria's blood ran cold as she read the words. What was he talking about? What secrets had he kept hidden? Her eyes darted back to the letter, desperately searching for answers. The Blackwood estate is not just a house, not just a collection of wealth. It is tied to something much older, something I have spent my life trying to understand. There are forces at play that you cannot yet comprehend, and I fear they will soon make themselves known. Be vigilant, Maria. Trust no one, not even those who claim to be helping you. The last line sent a shiver down her spine. Trust no one. Was Arthur warning her about Gregory Hale, about Edward Sinclair, the financial advisor, or someone else? She had no idea who she could turn to, and the more she thought about it, the more isolated she felt. There was a dark undercurrent running beneath everything, and she was only now beginning to see the full scope of it. Her hands trembled as she folded the letter and tucked it back into the drawer. The house felt colder now, more oppressive, as though it had been waiting for her to uncover the truth. What had Arthur gotten himself into, and why had he left it all to her? As she stood there, the candle flickering weakly in her hand, Maria became aware of a noise, so faint at first that she almost didn't hear it. It was coming from somewhere behind her, in the hallway. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, like someone pacing outside the door. Her heart lurched in her chest, and for a moment she was frozen, too terrified to move. She strained to listen, her breath caught in her throat. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside the study door. Maria's mind raced. Who could it be at this hour? The house was locked, and no one had any reason to be here. Panic surged through her as she considered her options. Should she confront whoever it was, or hide? Her instincts screamed at her to flee, to lock the door and wait for the intruder to leave. But something deeper, something primal, urged her to act. She took a slow, silent step toward the door, her heart pounding so loudly in her chest that she feared whoever was on the other side might hear it. With her free hand, she reached for the brass handle, barely daring to breathe as she twisted it open a crack. The hallway was empty. Maria stood there for a long moment, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. The house was silent once again, the only sound the faint crackle of the candle's flame. She felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was quickly replaced by confusion. She had been so certain, so sure that she had heard someone. Shaken, Maria closed the door and leaned against it, her mind spinning with questions. The letter, the footsteps, Arthur's cryptic warning. None of it made sense, and yet deep down she knew that whatever was happening, it wasn't over. Something, or someone, was watching her, waiting in the shadows, and it was only a matter of time before they made their move. For the rest of the night, Maria didn't sleep. She stayed in the study, the candle burning low as she read and reread the letter, trying to piece together the mystery Arthur had left behind. But with every passing hour, one thing became clear. She was no longer safe in Blackwood Manor. The secrets that Arthur had guarded so closely were now hers to protect, and there were forces, dark, unseen forces, waiting for her to make a mistake. And when they came for her, Maria feared that she might not be ready. The days that followed Maria's discovery of Arthur Blackwood's letter were a blur of fear, confusion, and dread. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was no longer alone in Blackwood Manor, that something or someone was watching her from the shadows. The mansion, once a place of work and routine, had become a labyrinth of dark corners and secret whispers. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards, sent her heart racing, and she found herself glancing over her shoulder constantly. The letter had changed everything. Arthur's cryptic warning, "Be careful, trust no one," echoed in her mind every waking moment. She had tried to reach out to Gregory Hale, the solicitor, hoping that he could shed more light on what Arthur had meant. But every attempt had been met with silence. Hale, once reliable and professional, seemed to have disappeared. His office gave vague excuses about his absence, and Maria could feel her isolation growing with each passing day. Edward Sinclair, the financial advisor, continued to visit, always impeccably dressed, and with his assistant Emily by his side. Sinclair's calm demeanor and smooth reassurances about the estate's finances felt increasingly hollow to Maria. She couldn't forget Arthur's warning to trust no one, and she began to view Sinclair's offers of help with suspicion. Was he part of whatever Arthur had been trying to protect her from? The thought gnawed at her, even though she had no evidence to support it. The mansion, too, seemed to have taken on a life of its own. Maria had once known every inch of it, from the grand ballroom to the forgotten servants' quarters in the attic, but now it felt unfamiliar. There were rooms she avoided, without realizing why. Doors that were always slightly ajar, no matter how many times she closed them. And then there were the noises. Soft, almost imperceptible sounds that she couldn't quite explain. Footsteps in the night. The rustle of fabric in an empty room. The faint sound of voices just on the edge of hearing. One evening, as Maria was preparing to retire to her room, she heard it again. The distinct sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the floor above. Her heart leaped into her throat. It was the same sound she had heard the night she found Arthur's letter. The same footsteps that had stopped outside the study door. This time, however, she wasn't going to let fear paralyze her. Grabbing the nearest thing she could find, a heavy candlestick, Maria made her way up the stairs, the wooden banister cold beneath her trembling hand. The hallway stretched out before her, dimly lit by the flickering sconces on the walls. She held her breath as she listened, trying to pinpoint the source of the footsteps. They were faint now, almost as if whoever, or whatever, was in the house didn't want to be found. She moved slowly down the corridor, her bare feet making no sound on the thick carpet. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to keep going. As she reached the door to Arthur's private wing, the footsteps suddenly stopped. For a moment, Maria stood there in the silence, unsure of what to do. She could feel the weight of the mansion pressing in around her, its dark secrets lurking just beyond the edge of her understanding. With a deep breath, She reached out and turned the doorknob, pushing the door open. The room beyond was cold, unnaturally so. The air seemed to cling to her skin, sending a shiver down her spine. The candlelight barely penetrated the darkness, casting long, flickering shadows across the room. Arthur's desk sat in its usual place, the papers on it undisturbed since her last visit. But something was different. The atmosphere was heavier, more oppressive, as if the room itself were alive with unseen eyes. Maria stepped inside cautiously, the floor creaking beneath her feet. She glanced around, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. There was nothing, no one in sight. And yet, she could feel it, a presence, something that lingered just beyond her perception. Her gaze was drawn to the far wall, where the massive bookshelf stood. She had seen it dozens of times before, had dusted its shelves and polished its wood, but now something about it caught her attention. One of the books, an old leather-bound volume, was slightly askew, sticking out just a fraction more than the others. It was subtle, something she wouldn't have noticed if not for the oppressive silence that filled the room. Curiosity battled with fear as she approached the bookshelf. The closer she got, the more certain she became that this was no accident. The book had been moved, intentionally placed to draw her attention. She reached out with a trembling hand and pulled the book from the shelf. It was heavier than she expected, the leather cracked and worn with age. As she held it in her hands, a strange sensation washed over her, like a whisper at the back of her mind, just out of reach. Her fingers brushed against the cover, and without thinking she opened it. The pages were brittle, yellowed with time, and filled with symbols and writings she didn't recognize. It wasn't written in any language she had ever seen. Strange, intricate markings covered the pages, spirals and shapes that seemed to shift and change as she looked at them. The more she stared, the more dizzying it became, like staring into an abyss that pulled her deeper with every second. A cold wind swept through the room, and the candle flame flickered wildly. Maria's breath caught in her throat. The temperature seemed to drop even further, and the shadows around her began to stretch and writhe as if they were alive. She wanted to close the book, to put it back, and pretend she had never found it, but something wouldn't let her. Some invisible force compelled her to keep looking, to keep reading, even though she couldn't understand the words on the page. Her heart raced as a realization dawned on her. This book, whatever it was connected to the secrets Arthur had been guarding. The letter had warned her, told her to be careful. And now, standing in this room with the ancient tome in her hands, Maria understood why. Arthur hadn't been afraid of losing his fortune. He had been afraid of something far worse. Before she could process what was happening, the door to the study slammed shut with a deafening bang. Maria jumped, dropping the book in shock. It hit the floor with a thud, the pages fanning out across the polished wood. She spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. The room felt even colder now, the darkness closing in on her. Someone or something was in the room with her. She could feel it, the weight of its presence pressing down on her, the air thick with tension. The shadows seemed to twist and contort, taking on shapes that were almost human, but not quite. Maria's breath came in shallow gasps as she backed away from the bookshelf, her eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape. But there was nowhere to run. The shadows shifted again, and this time they coalesced into a figure, a tall, gaunt silhouette that seemed to rise from the floor itself. Maria froze, her blood turning to ice. The figure had no face, only a vague impression of a head and body, but its presence was unmistakably malevolent. It loomed over her, its form rippling like smoke, and though it made no sound, Maria could feel its intent as clearly as if it had spoken. It wanted the book. The realization hit her with terrifying clarity. Whatever this thing was, it had been drawn to the book, the same book that Arthur had hidden away, the same book that had driven him to leave everything to her. Maria's mind raced. Had Arthur been protecting her? Or had he used her as a shield, passing this curse on to her when he couldn't bear it anymore? Her legs felt like lead, but she forced herself to move. She needed to get out of the room, to escape this thing that was closing in on her. She lunged for the door, her fingers grasping the cold brass handle. But it wouldn't budge. The door was locked, trapping her inside with the entity that now filled the room. Panic surged through her, but she couldn't let it consume her. She had to think. Arthur had left her clues, warnings. The letter had said to be careful. But what else? There had to be something more. Her eyes flicked to the book on the floor, its pages still open, the strange symbols glowing faintly in the dim light. With a surge of desperation, Maria dropped to her knees and grabbed the book. She didn't know what she was doing, but instinct guided her hands. She flipped through the pages, scanning the strange symbols for anything that made sense. There, near the middle of the book, was a single page that seemed different from the rest. The symbols were larger, more intricate, and in the center was a strange circular design that pulsed with an otherworldly energy. The figure in the shadows moved closer, and Maria could feel its cold breath on her skin. Time was running out. With trembling hands, she placed the book on the floor, the strange circular design facing up. She didn't know why, but she felt compelled to trace the symbol with her fingers. As she did, the room seemed to shift. The walls trembled and a low hum filled the air, vibrating through the floor beneath her. The figure let out a low, guttural sound, a noise that reverberated deep in Maria's bones. It didn't like what she was doing. She pressed harder, her fingers tracing the pattern faster now, as the hum grew louder and the air around her crackled with energy. Suddenly the figure recoiled, its form distorting violently as the hum reached a fever pitch. The book pulsed with light, and with a final deafening crack, the figure dissolved into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. The room was silent again. Maria collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. The oppressive weight that had filled the room was gone, leaving only the cold, empty air in its place. She stared at the book in front of her, the strange symbols still glowing faintly. Whatever had just happened, whatever she had done, she knew this was only the beginning. The secrets Arthur had kept were far darker than she had imagined, and now they were hers to unravel. But one thing was certain. She wasn't alone in this house. Not anymore.